Well, good morning, everyone. How you guys doing today? Good. Well, as you heard, we had about half the church up at the camping trip at various times. Quite a few of them are back. Some of them are not. And so please keep them in your prayers. It was not as hot as last year, which was a great blessing. If any of you guys heard about the great heat wave that we endured last year, it was pretty awful. But it did have me thinking about this idea of service, because one of the things that happens when you're camping is that you always remember that you forgot to pack something. Have any of you guys ever experienced that? You go camping and you think, oh man, I forgot this thing or that thing, and you're relying on other people to help you out. And so that it fits in perfectly with what we've been talking about with this sermon series called Shape to Serve. And today we're talking about how serving connects. And so we're going to be in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 through 15, if you like to turn there. There's a great passage here in the book of Galatians. Galatians is one of my favorite books of the New Testament, and this great passage in chapter 5 that starts off with talking about the great freedom that we have in Christ. And you know, what an amazing thing to think about is the freedom that you have in Jesus Christ, the freedom from the burden of your sin and all the things that were keeping you down before you met Christ. And really, there's a great exposition of all that stuff, and we're going to look at a little piece of that today, because I think it's interesting the way that Paul works out this argument. So in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 through 15, it says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." So he says, don't use your freedom as a means for sin, right? Don't use your freedom as an opportunity for sin. And I think that you know, what I would expect for him to say, and maybe what you would expect for him to say, is don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, as an opportunity for sin, but instead be righteous, right? Instead, read your Bible. Instead, pray. Instead, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a whole bunch of things that you could think of that would be the opposite of sin. And yet, Paul here has a very interesting approach, at least I thought so, and maybe it's obvious to everybody in the world but me, but I thought it was interesting how Paul says, look, this is not what you should be doing, is you should not be engaging in sinful fleshly behavior, but instead you should serve each other in love. He sees that as the opposite of sin. And so we want to look at what he's talking about here, because really what he's going to get to is this idea that serving connects us with one another. And so as we look at this, we're going to talk about, first of all, the argument that he's putting forward here. We want to look at how he structures this argument in chapter 5. We want to look at the idea of agendas in service. And then finally, we're going to look at how we connect all things together. So as we get into that, I think that you'll see that Paul here has a very cohesive and powerful argument that talks about how exactly service connects us with one another. As I was preparing for this sermon, I was reading about or saw a story about Jack Hayes. I don't know if any of you guys know who Jack Hayes is, but he was big in the Texas Rangers, right? Remember the Lone Ranger was a Texas Ranger. So he was a real life Texas Ranger, and he lived in the 1840s. And at that time, the big problem, the big scourge of Texas was the Comanche tribe, because at the time, the Comanches had been a small kind of tribe that was in the north, and they were generally a poor tribe that was having trouble kind of eking out a living. But then when the Spanish brought horses in, they embraced the horse like no other tribe, and it completely turned around their fortunes. They went from a tribe that was kind of barely making an existence to a tribe that was probably the most powerful and the most feared tribe in the West. And they moved south, and they had a whole bunch of territory that was a lot of Texas and some other areas. And in fact, the Mexican government kind of tolerated the Americans kind of moving into Texas because they saw them as a buffer between them and the Comanches. The Comanches were so feared that they wanted some protection there. But the Comanches were a problem for not just the American settlers there, but also for other Indian tribes. And so strangely enough, that some deep friendships were formed. And one of those deep friendships was between Jack Hayes, who was a legendary Texas Ranger, and Chief Flacco. And Chief Flacco was a guy who was an Apache chief. And for a long time, the Comanches and Apaches were kind of mortal enemies. And the Apaches were usually on the receiving end of a great amount of Comanche fury. And so, as it said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, well, Chief Flacco and Jack Hayes actually formed a very strong and very powerful friendship of mutual respect. And it kind of came to a head one time when about 200 to 300 Comanche warriors had been raiding around San Antonio, where Jack Hayes and Chief Flacco and their group of Texas Rangers were stationed. And what happened was that this group of 200 to 300 had raided and destroyed numerous settlements around the San Antonio area and had decided to leave before anybody could follow them. The Texas Rangers mounted a party of about 40 guys to go after them, and so they were greatly outnumbered. Maybe some of the people in the group of Texas Rangers were even hoping that they would never find them. They knew it was a large, powerful force of Comanches, and yet they did find them. And once they were found, they realized that their best tactic, because they were so outnumbered, was just to try to attack as quickly as possible before the Comanches could kind of orient themselves and really form their power into a devastating force against them. And so they decided to immediately go into the charge as they saw him. And Jack Hayes was completely irritated with one of the members of his group, because as he was riding, he had a very slow horse. He was riding, he noticed that there was a guy on a very powerful horse that was continually holding him back. And he seemed like this guy doesn't either know how to ride this horse, or he's not really keen on the battle. But either way, I want to change horses. And so he did. He changed horses with this guy. And what Mr. Hayes found, unfortunately, as soon as he got on the horse with this guy, was actually a very accomplished rider. But that this horse was so powerful and so poorly trained that you couldn't hold this horse back. And so no matter what Jack Hayes was doing, this horse was gaining ground on the group that had gotten ahead when they decided to change horses. And then he was riding with the group, and then he found himself ahead of the group. And so it was going to look like that he was going to take on this group of 200 to 300 Comanches single-handedly, because his horse was so powerful and so fast that it was outpacing all the other riders, and he realized that he was in big trouble. But he had a friend, Chief Flacco. And when Chief Flacco saw that Mr. Hayes was riding ahead and was going to take on this whole group single-handedly, he thought, what an amazing show of courage. And he also said to himself, I cannot let my friend do this alone. And so even though it was suicidal and Chief Flacco had control of his horse, he decided to spur his horse on to the greatest speed that horse was capable of so that he could be even with Jack Hayes. And they attacked 200 Comanches together. And they lived to tell the tale. And after the whole attack was done, it became a huge joke between Chief Flacco and Jack Hayes that he had too much courage. Well, that's what love and friendship will do, right? Love and friendship will make you see somebody and say, even though that guy looks like he's riding towards certain death, I cannot let him face that alone. And so, really what we see here is that, much like what is being told to us here in Galatians, is that there you have an opportunity of freedom. Chief Flacco could have done anything that he wanted to do at that day. He could have stayed safe and stayed with the group. He could have left the group. He could have stopped his horse. He could have turned around. There was any possibility ahead of him. He could do whatever he wanted to. And yet he chose out of love to serve someone else. So what's Paul's argument here? Let's look at this argument that Paul is giving out, because it's very interesting. Paul talks here first about freedom, and he talks about freedom in the situation of circumcision. Now, this doesn't seem to make any sense why he starts this way. In fact, the whole flow of this chapter is kind of interesting and a little bit strange, but he talks about this idea of circumcision. Now, you'll have to remember that Paul, as he went from church to church teaching, that there were often a group of what they were called Judaizers that would follow around after him, and when he would leave, he'd try to undo a lot of his teachings. Paul was teaching them about the freedom that they have in Christ Jesus and that they operate now through grace instead of the law. And part of that law is circumcision. And what would happen is, along after him would come the Judaizers that would say, no, you still have to follow the laws of the Jewish people and you have to get circumcised. And they would try to undo all the work he was doing. And so Paul here starts off with this argument is that in Christ Jesus, because of what he's done for us, Christ has kept the law for us. And so it's not necessary for you to be circumcised. In fact, if you feel like it is necessary for you to be circumcised as an act of obedience to God and as an act of covenantal unity with God, if that's the way you decide to go with the covenant, then you are under the law because you've accepted the law covenant through the act of that circumcision. Now, he's saying here that if you take on the law, if you want to take on the burden of the law, that's what you're stuck with. But you don't have to be. In fact, you will never get where you're going accepting that burden. And in fact, what God is calling you to and what Christ offers you is freedom. So take that freedom. Now, why were the Judaizers so adamant that Paul be corrected? Why did they constantly follow him around and correct him? Well, what they were afraid of is that if you realize that Jesus had kept the law for you, and so you're not going to be judged on your keeping of the law, well, then you'll run out wild. You'll go willy-nilly. There'll be sin here, sin there, sin everywhere. There'll be sin as far as the eye can see. Now, why would they think that? Well, I guess probably human nature, right? I mean, think about it. If you were, how many of you guys remember when you were kids and thinking to yourself, I can't wait till I grow up because I can do whatever I want? How many of you guys, you remember? And this is what you meant by that. You thought, I can eat all the vegetables that I want finally. I won't have to have junk food. I can eat all the vegetables I want. And I can go to bed earlier. Right? That's what you were thinking when you were a kid. You were thinking to yourself, I can't wait for freedom so that I can get rid of all this terrible behavior that my parents are putting. No, you didn't think that, did you? You thought to yourself, I want to grow up so I can do whatever I want. And by that you meant all the things probably that you were being kept from by the law of your parents. And so what did your parents do? They worried about you, didn't they? How many of you guys have had that experience of having a kid leave home and going, it's rough? You're like, I'm not there to be the law of protection over them so they could just run off willy-nilly and do all kinds of stuff. It's human nature. But Paul is making an argument here that there's something besides human nature at work in the world. And so Paul is saying, look, you have this freedom. You're not being judged. Your salvation is not being judged by you being righteous. Because if it were, all of us would be lost. And so therefore, you have freedom. And so why isn't it going to end up in just all kinds of sin all over the place? Well, because he's developing this argument. And this argument is that you have freedom from the law, from circumcision, from all that stuff, but instead of engaging in sin, you're going to engage in service. And then he's going to follow that up by telling us that we need to walk, therefore, by the Spirit. Now, again, this, in my mind, I don't understand exactly, or as I first read this, I didn't understand exactly how this was all making sense because it seemed a little odd to me. It seemed like it should go law, circumcision, freedom, then righteousness, and then walk by the Spirit. We're not going to do the bad things, we're going to do the good things. We're going to read our Bibles, we're going to pray, we're going to do all those things that we know we're supposed to do, and then walk by the Spirit. So we have to ask our question here, how is sin opposed to service? How is it that sin, the opposite of sin, is not righteousness, but the service in love that he's telling us we should engage in? Well, if you can think about it like a body, what's opposed to disease? What's opposed to disease? You could say health. But you could look deeper than that, right? So you could say that opposed to disease is health, and that would be like righteousness, right? Being right, having things in the right condition. But you can think about it a little deeper than that, and when you do, all of a sudden, what he's saying here makes a lot of sense, because what's the difference between health and disease? Health is what? Health is when all of our body parts serve one another, isn't it? All of our body parts are serving the whole body. I mean, if you think about it, if you end up like you have a pancreas in your body. I think we do. I don't know all of you that intimately, but let's just say we all have a pancreas. Now, what is that pancreas supposed to do? It's supposed to be healthy. Well, yes, but what do we mean by health? See, the problem is we put these labels on that aren't specific enough. What does it mean for the pancreas to be healthy? Well, the pancreas makes insulin. Why? So that all of our blood sugar and everything can be used by our muscles. I don't know all of the details. Look it up. You Google it. The point here is that the pancreas is serving the rest of the body. You see, so disease is not just opposed to health. Disease is opposed to the service, the interconnectedness of the body, and that's what really disease is. So in a sense, what we're saying here, Paul is laying out something really brilliant here, that really, what does it mean to be righteous? Because we could make the argument that it should go, we're free from the law and circumcision, we're free from all that, so therefore be righteous, walk in the Spirit. But we're going to be more specific than that, because righteousness has to be seen for what it is. What righteousness is that when we are in right standing with God and right standing with one another, what does it mean to be in right standing? It means we serve. And if we're not serving, there's some kind of disease, there's some kind of sin that's involved. Because that's literally what we were made for. It's like the pancreas saying, well, here's the thing. I'm not going to be disease-ridden. I'm just not going to serve the rest of my body. If a pancreas does that, does that work? I mean, does that argument work? I don't know if you argue with your pancreas, but would that work with you? Would you be okay with that? No, you would say that's an impossibility, right? You can't say as a pancreas, I'm not going to be diseased. I don't want to be counted as a diseased pancreas, but I don't want to serve the rest of my body. Well, then you are diseased, right? This is what Paul is getting at here. The natural order of things, the natural healthy order of things is for us to be serving one another. That is the natural order of things. And if that's not happening, guess what? There's sin involved. That's what sin is. Sin is like a disease. Sin is a disorder. Sin is a lack of being in the right connection between God and between fellow believers. Anytime you're sinning, that's what you're doing. And you can say, well, I'm just sinning in my mind. It's just thoughts that I'm having. Well, guess what? You owe God and you owe others the proper thoughts toward them. Why? Because eventually that's going to work out in actions, but it's also going to affect you. Here's the thing. How many of you guys have ever had to serve somebody when you didn't want to? Anyone? Anybody ever have that job? Anybody ever have that, maybe you as a kid you were a babysitter and there was that one family? Or maybe you had that job as a teenager that you couldn't stand, but you needed the money and you couldn't get it, and you had to serve people and you hated it. And maybe you were able to fake it. Maybe you were the best faker ever. How many of you guys ever been to Disneyland and thought about how do these people do this all day? Anyone? I had a friend, or a relative actually, who did an internship at Disney. He was working at Disneyland, and they had apartment buildings. I don't know if it's still like this, but at the time they had these apartment buildings for all of their people who were interning and working there to stay at. And he said it was great. They had pool parties almost every day. They had volleyball courts. They had trips that they would take you on. They did all this stuff. Why did they do that? Because they wanted you to be happy. Because then you could serve. Right? Because they knew that eventually if you had a bad attitude, it would come out. But let's say you're the best faker in the world. And let's say you decide, I'm going to fake this and nobody's ever going to know. Here's the thing. What are you doing to your own soul? What are you doing to yourself? So the point here is important, that the hand is a hand precisely because it can do hand things for the rest of the body. The foot is a foot precisely because it can do foot things for the rest of the body. You cannot take a hand and sever it and put it away from the body and say, hey, you have no responsibility of the body anymore, and have it not be a diseased hand, have it not be a problem. In the same way, if we decide to sin, what we're doing is we're shirking and destroying the connection between us and other people. We're like the body part that refuses to do its job. And so whenever we choose sin, what we're doing is choosing disease. And the thing is that it's so foolish because whoever did that, whoever says, man, you know what I really want out of life? Cirrhosis of the liver. You know what I really want out of life? I want congestive heart failure. That's, if I could just have that, I would be happy. But here's the thing. We don't do that, do we? But how many people say, you know what I really want out of life? And then if they were really honest about what they were going to put in that, it would be some sort of sin, some form of sin. And that's the spiritual equivalent of wishing on yourself cirrhosis of the liver or congestive heart failure. That's what it is. And so, Paul finishes his argument here by saying we need to walk in the Spirit. So in Galatians chapter 5, verse 16 and 17, the part after this passage, it says, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For those are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. He's saying there's a spirit at work that's not reliant on the law. My liver, hopefully, doesn't need somebody telling it all the time, this is what you need to do. It's going to do that by its nature, by what it is. It's designed for it. It wants, so to speak, to do that. In the same way, we were all designed, we were shaped to serve one another. And so if we have the Spirit of God in us, the Spirit of God is the Spirit to glorify, to love, to make blessed, to serve. And that's what we've been shaped to do. And so if we operate by the Spirit, we don't need a law telling us to do these things. We desire to do these things. And so there's a problem of the law, and the law being used for salvation is never going to work. And so Paul says that's why you have to go away from that, embrace your freedom, and embrace the love of one another, to serve one another, embrace who you were made to be. So let's talk about agendas and service, because the immediate thing that people will say when you talk about this is, well, if I do that, then I'll just be part of somebody's agenda. Have you ever thought about that or feared that? Somebody will take advantage of me. Somebody will just say, oh, yeah, I need this, and I need this, and I need this, and I need this. And how many of you have ever been in that sort of relationship? You don't have to raise your hands, but you can. I appreciate that. But if it would get you in trouble, don't feel like you need to. So here's the thing. I think all of us, if we're honest, would raise our hands to this, that we have been in that kind of relationship where we have this problem that we're experiencing where somebody just, once they realize that we're willing to serve them, once they realize that we're willing to love them, they'll say, hey, I need a whole bunch of stuff. I need this and this and this and this. And man, if you say no to this, you don't really love me. And then they'll start doing that. And so we're all afraid of this. And so we all feel like we need to protect ourselves from just being who God made us to be. In Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 37, there's an interesting thing that happens here. And what happens is that people kind of live up to what we would think they would do. Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 37. The context of this is Jesus has been talking to his disciples about the fact that he's going to have to be killed. It's serious, and Jesus is talking about his sacrifice. And the disciples are kind of being quiet. And it says, and they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Jesus is saying here something very profound and something we're very afraid of embracing. And I don't care who you are, there's part of you, if you understand what's happening and what Jesus is calling us to, this should strike some fear into you. And I think that it probably does, whether we want to admit it or not. Jesus is saying here, we need to serve. That's who we are. That's what we are made to be. You're not made to protect yourself. You're not made to isolate yourself. You're made to serve. And he's talking about his own service to the disciples. And rather than them saying, oh yeah, we should probably do that too, what are they arguing about? They're arguing about who's the greatest. And so what does Jesus, who obviously is the embodiment of what he's talking about, he is the least of all, what does he do? He sits them down and he rebukes them. He instructs them. He scolds them, however you want to say it. He says, you got it wrong. You got it wrong. Why does he do that? How can Jesus be saying you have to be the least of all and the servant of all, and then embody sitting down the 12 and rebuking them? It seems to go against what he's saying, right? No, it's because we have the wrong idea of what service means. Service does not mean adopting the other person's agenda. That's not what service means. Service doesn't mean that if this guy wants to do this or this girl wants to do that, and then you're going to serve them, that you just have to do that because that's what they want. Service doesn't mean adopting their agenda. Service means adopting God's agenda. And God's agenda is that you glorify and bless them. And that doesn't mean doing whatever they want you to do. It doesn't mean becoming a doormat. It doesn't mean any of those things. It doesn't mean all the things that most of the time in fear keep us from doing the positive things that we could do if we just adopted God's agenda and didn't worry about their agenda. Jesus is opposed to their agenda. So it's interesting that Jesus says something really fascinating in that about being the last, and that's really tough. He says, if anyone would be first, he must be the last of all and the servant of all. What does that mean? Does that mean we just have to hate ourselves? I'm the lowest, I'm the worst? No, I don't think that's what it means at all. He means to think of yourself last. How many of you guys have ever seen the show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe? Anybody ever seen that show? It's a great show. I like it a lot. I appreciate that I'm not the one doing those jobs, mostly. But one of the things that he came up with is, he already heard it from one of the people he was working with. I think it was when they were on the Bering Strait. He was talking to a captain, and he had mentioned the safety first. And the captain said, no, it's safety third. Well, what do you mean it's safety third? That doesn't make any sense. He said, if it was safety first, we wouldn't come out here and fish. I mean, if we wanted to be safe, we would stay at home. It's safety third. Now, here's the thing. He's not saying that safety isn't important. It is. There's a place for it in the hierarchy, but it's not first. And the thing that I think Jesus is saying here is not that you're not important. It's to say that there are other things to think about before you think about yourself. There are other things to think about. Because here's the thing, the reason that we usually think about ourselves is because we're afraid that if we're not looking out for ourselves, nobody else is. But what Jesus has shown us is that that's not true. I can give up constantly thinking about myself because God's already doing that. Jesus is already doing that. God's already planning on how to. The Bible tells us that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Do we believe that? Because if we believe that, then we can stop thinking incessantly about our own worries and our own mind. We're constantly thinking, what if I don't have a good enough retirement? What if nobody likes me? What if, we go on and on with this list of things. And if we would just stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about God and about what he's doing in the lives of other people and how we could be a part in that, then really we would have a lot better life. And we would be much more effective. If you want to be first, think of yourself last. Think of God first, other people, and then think of yourself. Jesus is discussing his death with his disciples, and all they can think about is which one of them is the greatest. That had to be hugely disappointing. And yet, what does Jesus do? He sits them down. He lets them know what the reality and the truth is. Why? So that they can be blessed. So what happens is that when we walk in the Spirit, and when we free ourselves of others' agenda and we get on God's agenda, is it allows us to serve joyfully. Because really, a lot of times that's what destroys our joyful service. When we feel like we're being part of somebody else's agenda, all of a sudden that takes all the joy out of that service. But if we just ignore their agenda and worry about what is God's agenda in this person's life, then it allows us, walking in the Spirit allows us to joyfully serve them and to know the limits when we say, hey, that's not where I'm going with this. God's not going there. God doesn't want you there, so I'm not going to help you to get someplace God doesn't want you to go. Well, finally, we need to talk about connecting all things. Because I think this is part of the bigger picture here that Paul is making this argument about, and I think it's very fascinating. Really, what Paul is saying is that sin is the thing that disconnects us from God and other people. Right? Think about it that way. What is sin? Sin is the thing that disconnects you from God and from other people. Well, if that's the case, then really what a lot of this is about then is connecting. And that's exactly what Jesus says over and over. Jesus in chapter 17 of John goes on this extended speech to his disciples. He's going to be killed and he needs them to know what's going on. And he says to them, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. And he goes on to explain to them that this relationship of love that has been going on for all eternity between him and the Father, he wants to join us, he wants to bring us into that. He wants to make sure that we're a part of that connectedness that he has with the Father. And if we do that, if we're connected with him to the Father, then what will happen is we'll be connected to one another. And so this connection is a big part. And just like a body, the thing is, how many of you guys have ever come across a body part just laying there? Anyone? I do want to see a hand for this because I want to talk to you after. Okay, great. We'll talk later. It's weird, isn't it? Josh, is it weird? Okay. So it's weird. You don't expect that. You don't just see body parts hanging around on their own. You don't just walk along and, oh, there's a hand, it just doesn't happen. But spiritually, it happens all the time. Spiritually, what happens is different parts of the body of Christ are disconnected from him, and they're laying around all the time, and we walk by it, and even if we are one of those parts, we don't think that it's weird. But can you imagine from God's perspective how weird it is, because we were committed to each other in the act of creation. There is a covenantal unity of all things that God creates. That all things are united in a covenant of a relationship with God where all things are made to glorify him. All things are made to glorify him. There is a connection of all things. All of creation was made for this relationship with God. So that's kind of like, we can think of it maybe this way, and this isn't trying to be hippie or anything like that, because you know me, I'm not much of a hippie. But you can think of it as kind of all things like an organism where all the functions, all the parts of it serve their function. All the parts of it serve each other, and everything's supposed to be connected in that way. Well, what is the function that it serves? Glorifying God is the function that it serves. And all over the Psalms, you see this kind of language. Let me give you an example. In Psalm chapter 33, it says in verse 1, "Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous." Well, why is it addressed to the righteous? Why shouldn't everybody shout for joy in the Lord? Well, the people who aren't righteous can't. That's part of what it means not to be righteous. Right? They can't take joy in their connectedness to God. They can't take joy in the fact that they were created for a specific purpose to glorify God and to serve each other, because serving each other glorifies God. That's the kind of God that he is. They can't take joy in that. And so you address this to the people who can actually do it, the righteous. Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Why? Once again, the upright are people who are in right relationship with God. They're going to do this. Verse 2, give thanks to the Lord with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. Why? Because that's the job of the lyre and the harp. Why are the lyre and the harp created? To bring praise to God. You know, so many times I hear people who aren't Christians, and they talk about how one of the weirdest things for them if they do go to church is the worship service. And they find it strange to sing songs to God. And one of the things they'll ask him was, well, what kind of things aren't strange to sing songs about? And, well, love and this and that. Well, those things are great. Those things are good. But God is the epitome of that. Why would it be not strange to sing songs to a lesser version than the greater thing? It's like saying, singing a song to a Pinto makes sense, but singing a song about a Ferrari doesn't make any sense. Maybe that doesn't work. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. Why? Well, that's what your voice is made to do. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. Man, what a powerful passage this is. For the word of the Lord is upright. The word of the Lord, the word that created all these things, everything that his word creates, interconnects and creates the relationships between. And it is all perfect. It is all right. It is all good. It all works together for glory and blessing. Everything that he does works for that, and he is faithful in everything he does. The covenant bindings between him and everything are always kept in everything that he does. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. Well, why does he love righteousness and justice? Because when you live in righteousness and justice, you're taking seriously your responsibilities to serve one another and to act in the right way toward one another. You're taking seriously the glory of the Lord and how it's supposed to be manifest among us in our relationships. That the connectedness that God desires for us, there is nothing better in your living that out in your life. What could be better than that? By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. His word has created everything, and everything's job is to glorify him, and you can be connected to that. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. Your job is to be connected to everybody else and everything else in glorifying and serving the God who created all of us. That's what we were made for. That's what God is calling us to. We have freedom for that. And Paul's argument is, who says to themselves, well, now that I have a disease, boy, am I free? No. That's why Paul's not afraid of us, even though our righteous acts are not the things that save us. Paul's not afraid of us then going out and doing all kinds of terrible things, because all those terrible things are a withdrawal from the freedom and the unity that God has created us for. They're all a withdrawal from the connectedness between us and other people, us and all of creation. You want to withdraw from that? Why would you do such a thing? You don't need a law to tell you this. You have the Spirit of God within you to tell you this. You don't need somebody telling you all the time, do this thing, do that thing. Here's the thing. I noticed this a long time ago. If you've ever seen somebody going the extra mile, you probably just met the owner or the manager. Have you ever noticed that? Like you have a restaurant or something like that, and you got the employee who's paid by the hour. This would probably be me when I was, back during those things, during that time of my life. And, I knew what I was required to do, and I would do it. But then I would always watch as like the district manager or somebody like that, one of the higher-ups came in. And on their way in, they'd be picking up garbage from the parking lot. I remember when I was working at JB's, there was a district manager, and I was in there cleaning the bathrooms because we had to do that once every hour. And he came in there and he washed his hands, and then he took the paper towels and he wiped his hands off, and then he took those partially wet paper towels and he wiped down the sink with them, and he wiped down the mirror with them. Why? Was somebody telling him to do this? Did somebody tell him to do this? No. Why did he do it? Because he had the Spirit in him. He had a spirit of, I want this place to succeed. I want the things that I have responsibility for to succeed. I could wash my hands and then tell the dishwasher to come in here and clean this countertop off, or I can do it right now because I don't need to be told to do these things because I have the Spirit in me. That's what God is calling us to. That's what you have been given when you were reborn into Christ. You've been given the Spirit of God. so you can be connected to all things. And service is the way that we do this.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Hey, have a great week.